Rebecca. Go ahead, Jamil.
I do want to acknowledge, thank everybody for being here this Thursday evening. I know most of you, and I appreciate tremendously the support and just being here, so thank you. And thank you, Usha, for participating.
Thanks, Jamil. I haven't done this before. I'm not an art historian. I'm a film and media person, and so I really appreciate your taking a risk and inviting me to be a conversation. But I just love the work, and I love the work that you've done in the past as well. And when we run into each other at Stanford, we've long had conversations about your work. And so I wanted to I'm seeing them in person today, and I'm really struck by the scale, struck by the kind of poppy colors. And I wanted to ask you about, maybe to start off thinking about your body as it presents itself in your work in multiple series that you've done, in relation to textures and colors, and how across this work it feels like queerness is this sensual and sensory experience. And so if you could take us through the process, especially for Odyssey, but and connect it to earlier work as well.
Most of you know this. I'm Brazilian, and I grew up in a very conservative household and environment, and I feel like from the very early age, there was a sense of queerness being robbed, being denied, being shut down, shut off. And I feel through my adulthood, in a sense, through my art making, the conversation of activating my body to be seen, to be acknowledged as queer body, in a sense, and then there's the complication about being an immigrant, right, in this country as well. So there's a lot of the idea of being present as to uphold a sense of what once was taken away from me, in a sense, from not only from home, but then as I grew up, through schooling, right? I feel like the conversation of my masculinity is a performance that I really learned how to portray and embody. I was a very feminine kid growing up, and that put me in a lot of trouble, right? And from quite early on, I started to pay attention to how I move and how I embody myself, how I hold myself in a space. And I, in a sense, constructed that for myself. By making collaborations through my work with other people who identify themselves as queer, I came to acknowledge how much my experience also connects to other people's experience in relation to that, right? And I think my work is a way for me to activate some of these ideas. It is playful, it's colorful, is visible, right? There's a presence to them, not only the scale, but the conversation of color. I would think about color in relation as a medium that I can not only manipulate, but activate. And color goes beyond culture, goes beyond ideas that is fixed, right? Depending on the cultural background that you have, color shift in what that means or what that connotation is. I've always been very connected with this idea of the costume, the fabric, the materials that we wear to speak or to express something about us. And I think this new body of work is about manipulating materials, about really activating materials in a different way, that everything feels malleable and transitional and unfixed. So in a sense, the entry to my work comes from, I think, those ideas.
Yeah, and just looking at the images that you'd shared with me earlier, I was thinking about how this work really counters how masculinity is about hardness, and there's so much playfulness with texture, with softness, with feathers, with frills, with glitter and metallic textures. But also then we get to see your feet or a glimpse of a leg somewhere. And so there is this, your presence is also there, and there is a playful kind of invitation into the work. And I was wondering if that also has to do with these multiple cultures that you call home. I mean, you're Brazilian, you're Arab, you're San Franciscan, right? You're bringing all of these selves together to do something with making a particular kind of queerness visible.
I believe more as queer as a multitude, right? As a refusal, as something to to activate a sense of possibility. And I think the new work is about that for me. Right? And the possibilities there are also in flux. Nothing's fixed. When you go and think about the sculpture and then the daguerreotype that I also have in the show, it's how to fix that history. How to think about photography in relation to othering people. Right? There's a history of photography is very complicated, and how much has other people over and over and over again. And I think a way to queer those ideas led me here. Right? So there's a conversation also how that sculpture or how the daguerreotype connects to this work. How can I fix those ideas in a way that feels visible now through this image that we have here. The body is important. Every time that I take the body out, the work doesn't connect. So I've learned how to activate for myself in my art practice to use my body as a tool. Right? So I feel like more and more the work is less about me and more about the idea. In the beginning, I would make self-portrait. It was about me. It was a conviction. I'm here. And I think over the years that has changed tremendously. In activating my body to speak about what I find important in relation to this possibility of identity, right? Possibility of gender, possibility of sexuality. We live in a society that everything is so fixed, it's so binary. More and more this being a conversation is changing, right? But it's still, when we get out of the Bay Area, it's very convoluted, the reality out there. Russia today, I was reading a news about Russia again, but the conversation of by law, if you are an activist about LGBTQ rights, then you're a criminal. Right? There's a language around that happened today. This was in the news this morning. So it's a constant battle, right? Constant denial. And for me, it's a conversation about why. Right? I think for the longest time in my life, I was trying to figure out why, the reasoning, but I can't explain. But on the other side of the coin, I can be in the studio and externalize these ideas. Right? And I don't want to make something that feels celebratory, that feels luminous, that feels present in a way that is not hopeful is the word, but it is present as something, I don't want to say beautiful. I don't think about my work as I'm pursuing beauty, but I'm pursuing something that feels playful and present, right? This idea of celebration is important for me, especially because going back to the conversation of being denied of queerness, of my own identity, and then meeting so many people who share the experience. So I think that more than ever, this idea of affirming celebration is important. So there's a lot of me. I find the work to be very political. Right? I find this image, all this image in a sense, there's a very sense of, there's something political here. That informs my work. I teach photography, so I teach a lot of conversation in relation to race representation, right? To gender representation, and try to decenter or decenter the whiteness around these topics. And in a way, using color to expand on that, right? To break all of these norms. So the work speaks to that a lot. My previous series, Hues, some of you were part of that work right here. Right? Exactly. It was very important for me. I worked for 4 years with collaborations with other people and learning about people's experience and learning how everything's unfixed. Right? Even the portraits, I look back at the portraits that I did, they're historical portraits now, in a sense. And we change, people change. So there's something to be said about that too. Photography ages well. I always think about that, and I teach that in my classes. The idea of photography aging, because it accumulates meaning. Right? It's never fixed photography. The ideas here are going to continue. Right? They become historical, but also the meaning accumulates. So there's something to be said about that. So, yeah.
I mean, I look back at the photographs and Hues, and I think about you. We were just talking about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and that so much has changed in the last few years with the pandemic and just people moving away. But the photograph remains as this moment of a kind of queer history right here in this moment that you created in community with others, and that is really beautiful. And in these works, I was wondering about you being both the author and the subject, right? You're solo, but you're solo and surrounded by so much. There is an excess of kind of ornamentation, of decoration that brings in it's playful, but it's also kind of really, that excess is doing some work of, like, I think about Marcel Duchamp's note descending the staircase here.
Interesting, yes.
You're taking a whole bunch of art references and making them your own. So if you wanted to tell us a bit about the process of thinking, how much time did you take between each? Do you then just sit with it and think about what do I want to do next? Like, how does the series come together as a concept, and then when do you stop?
Something there's so much process. This is a great question because there's so much process here in relation, and so the work is very physical. I use color to activate for myself an entry door. So there's something about color that entices me, and I choose a color, and I think about color combination, and I think about materials that I can manipulate, and then I'm in the studio with this work alone, and I'm moving. It's a constant moving. The camera is on a tripod. I have 9 shots. The camera that I have a setting for 9 shots only. So I take the photographs, and then I go back and I look what I did, and then the gestures that is happening forms the next 9 that I'm gonna do. And then I go back, so I'm always informed about what's happening at that moment. And when I say it's transitional, it's in flux, it's temporal, it really is. Each gesture is just that moment, and then I go. And each of the session, it's long because I'm jumping up and down, dancing sometimes. Sometimes depending on how I feel, based on the news, based on what the things that inform us, I start very, very static, and then I try to figure out a way to keep expanding a conversation of movement. So this idea of being an author and a subject is interesting because the process is that. Like, the authorship is by behind the camera, but then there's a conversation of chance as well. Right? What happens through the chance, through the mood, the shapes that are being represented. So it's a constant process, I would say. Right? And again, I think about the body to activate the conversation. Right? It's the gesture to activate this possibility. More and more about ideas of possibility, what's possible. I feel like I arrived something very special for me in my practice with this show, with this work, to continue to generate more and more a state of possibility, more and more. The sculpture is my first sculpture. I've never done sculpture before. I have a professor doing my sculpture, Professor Leon, that I came for years ago. Terribly here. So, and it's nice, it's interesting. So the conversation of the reference, historical reference. I come from academia. I love academia. I really do. I teach at a university, right? I teach at Stanford. I went to that school as well. So I've always been drawn to academia, to the language of academia, to books of academic books. I'm very connected to that. And I see a lot of work, a lot of artworks, constantly museums. A friend of mine once mentioned this to me. When you travel, you're always going to museums. You always figure out a way to get to the art. And it's important to educate myself, to continue. And in a sense, this idea of the author, being the author, the subject, connects to those references as well. Right? Then going back to the sculpture becomes an intro, for me, a different modality to work. Right? There's a media scene photography. Photography is very directional, and sculpture is a three-dimensional thing, right? And I mean, I'm very, very sort of inspired by the possibility of continuing to also to integrate sculpture in my practice, but always to unfix what's fixed, right? This idea that unfixed is important to me. Anyway, that's the...
How do you know when to end a series?
Oh yes, how do I? Yeah, good question. That is.
Or are you still doing it?
So, where's Rebecca? Rebecca.
Deadline.
Rebecca saw this work in the early stage of the work, And it's interesting. And she saw the Lady Justice work as well in the beginning, right? And to see the growth of the work, right? And see the image of the work, or how to elevate the work just to, in a sense, visually, right? Through composition, through what the image is saying. That pink photograph right here, the blue, that was an anchor for me. I arrived at that image right here, this pink one. I arrived at that image, and that image brought me back to this work. There was something that, if I arrived here, there's something else to explore, there's more. And this work, I realized for the last, 2 years, in a sense? It's a lot of photo shoots, a lot of color, a lot of fabrics. And the idea to continue to elevate, to arrive here. This is a long process of photographs that didn't quite work. The visually didn't resonate. And then, it's sort of this ongoing process of when do I stop? I still have more. I'm very, very happy, in a sense, joyful about the responses that I'm getting through the show, because also as an artist, you learn through the process. One thing for me to do the work, have friends to come and help me to be critical about the work, show Rebecca and we think about the work. Another experience is for you to have an audience to then take in the work and acknowledge the work in a different way that I might have acknowledged. So I learned through the process as well. So I find that a lot of this experience right now is informing what comes next, essentially, for me. This conversation even, right? This idea of what is it that I'm embodying more and more that can be extrapolated to the work as I continue to produce the work. So it's this artist's life, right? So when I stop, when I die. It's ongoing. It really is. Also, one more thing about that, because it's important, the conversation of queerness, right? This idea of when I went to grad school, I wanted to be a queer artist. I wanted to have that badge for myself. And some people found that to be limited. And I wanted to be a voice. And I feel that the work is a voice now. And I feel more and more I have realized that for myself as an artist. I'm not concerned if the label, I'm queer artist, I'm not. This idea of these labels that might put you in a route. No, I feel like for myself, I wanted to be an example that I did not have. And I'm using that through my art making, in a sense. So, yeah.
That's really great. And it's also, you said body again, and I was thinking between the sculpture, the daguerreotype, and here, you're always present in that work. Like, you model for yourself the body, and there is a non-binariness in the sculpture and the daguerreotype, and this kind of putting on body parts and prosthetics, but in a playful, sexy, but also political way. I often have students saying, how do I represent non-binariness on film if they're writing about film? Or I'm ace, how do I represent asexuality on film? Why don't we have these? And I was like, it's a process. It's not like this linear, you go through the LGBTQIA. There's always a plus at the end of it, that we're always kind of still searching. And the minute you stop, then you've kind of stabilized queerness into this noble thing, right? But that it's in the not knowing, it's in the exploring. And so do you feel you're getting at something that is non-binary in these works?
It's a constant possibility. Something that
and do these different media allow you to get to it in some way?
It's in a way, it's to, again, a conversation, unfixing the process, right? Unfixing the idea. On a personal level, this is very personal, but I'm sharing in relation to my understanding of my own sexuality growing up. I grew up in Brazil, very, very conservative family. I never understood that it could be possible to be a gay person or a queer person. My idea based on television was if a gay man was a man who wanted to be a woman. And I did not have that identification. Therefore, in my head, I was not gay. So I became very asexual for many, many, many years, I feel. And then later on, by understanding a history of San Francisco, of queerness, and this idea started to have examples that I could grasp on and understand and find identification for myself. So that led me to my own journey around right? This is my own sort of individual journey about my understanding about my sexuality, about my queerness. But I feel that we're in a moment now that's very important to question these ideas of being fixed over and over and over and over again, right? And I feel my work brings that question about a state of possibility, right? That is not based on sexuality. How to think about queerness without thinking about sexuality, right? How can I move about ideas of queerness beyond sexuality? Right? How to think about queerness as a refusal to the norm. It's a way to embody not a struggle, but an awareness as a binary, very rigid categorization of all of us, right? Sex, in race. And I think about queerness as a refusal to that categorization. So that's sort of how these things play out in the work for me.
Yeah, we were discussing a film from southern India today, and one of the quotes about the film was, "Queerness is about constant disruption. It's not about a fixed identity, but it's the minute you stop disrupting, it's no longer queer." And maybe that is something that is.
It's interesting, this idea of queer, like even queerness, right? This category, right? Queer, it's a category, has become this thing. It's an umbrella, and it's that umbrella that continues to be elastic, but it's still an umbrella, right? So there's this need, somehow, culturally, to put things in these lanes, right? But what happened when we did this, right? Because life is this, right? Life is an ongoing saga, for all of us. So this idea of the non-binary is a language that we have more and more now, right? So I feel like the evolution also activates language for us, different terminologies. I engage with students as well, similar ideas. Like students will come and who I know by who are I'm not this, I'm not that, and they're trying to figure out where, right? And photography or art making becomes a tool of expression as an outlet, right? They can be critical, obviously, also can be very personal and self-discovery. So I think a lot of this has to do with the idea of transformation. So it's a third transformation of the self, right? I think about the war. We're in a war, there's war happening all over the news, we all, right? And think about heritage. And I think about this idea that even ideas of heritage is fluid. If there's a war that comes to here, knock on wood, but comes to the Bay Area, then that war becomes our heritage as well. So this idea that even the ideas of heritage that we think might be fixed, it continues to be compounded by time, by politics, by economics, and so forth. Everything is very expansive, right? It expands. It's never like just one. Anyway, I feel like the work speaks to a lot of that conversation for me. It's my way of activating that, but it's important. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about any particular work? Both in terms of process and just things you want us to look at and think about.
So a conversation for me that's being very important, and some of the questions during the opening was the kind of materials that I use, right? And initially for me it was a conversation of using materials as part of photography. So the paper drop that I used then became a way to manipulate. There's a conversation of the paper itself, right? Referencing the practice of photography. And then it's very personal as well. The pink one here is my wedding dress. When I had a wedding. I have a husband. He's not here. He's working. And by the end of my wedding, I wore this skirt. As I said, I do. Right before the kiss, I was like, okay, I want to. So even I get queer in my wedding, right? As two men getting married. So I wore that, and as I'm looking for materials, then I was like, well, that was a statement for me then, right? And I wanted to use that here. So there's the personal as well. There's this awareness of photography, my medium that I use so much, right? And then the conversation of introducing of fabrics or objects that are very personal, right? And then moving away from the personal, right? The foam is something that I walk to a fabric store looking for things that I could manipulate and be flexible. And the color just grabbed me, and I was like, oh, that, and the foam has a smell. We all can, right? That smell, the texture, right? And then I took that home, and then it's a big roll, and then just kind of like collapsing it. I feel very connected to conversational reflection as well. This is a very important piece for me because it reflects light. So it's the idea of using materials that also reflect. Right? I'm using mylar. I'm using a whole row of mylar. And so arriving here, it triggered for me different ways to think about the work, because it's not just about us seeing something, it's about reflecting light. So the daguerreotype is interesting as well because it reflects, right? It reflects back. When you look at the daguerreotype, you see the image, but you also see yourself being reflected. For people who don't know, the daguerreotype is the first commercially viable process in photography. It was developed in France, 1830s, 1840s, and it's a Polaroid of its day. It's an image fixed on a piece of copper that's so well polished, so you get a reflection. And it also was designed to be held very intimately, not something to put on the wall. It's the idea of using the photography they can carry for yourself to be very private. So I'm thinking about in that piece, the idea of introducing a queer perspective to that history. So how that plays out for me. I don't know, that's the...
And kind of interesting going back to the past, taking old technologies and queering them through by putting yourself in them, right? So that these don't become things that dead white men invented.
Exactly.
You can go get it back.
So it's very important. Right? It's very, and the conversation of the Lady Justice, there's so much misogyny to the history of the configuration, the representation, iconography, right? I did extensive research on Lady Justice. I dove into the Louvre collection, the Met collection, the museums in England. I kept looking and looking for such the earliest representation I possibly could find on this mythological idea of justice. It's so problematic over the history. It's a porn of its day, right? It's a woman with the breast exposed. The design of the clothing, depending on the painting or the drawing that I found, the clothing is designed to reveal the breast. This idea that the breast is nourishment, right? It's a blindfolded woman, over-sexualized, to represent justice. And justice is extremely made by men, right? This idea. And think about justice to be so corrupted. So the idea of corrupting this representation of the women, it's such a problematic figure, right? I was telling Usha earlier on the conversation of the snake, or Maggie's here with our conversation of the snake as well. This idea of, there is representation that I found that there is justice. She is stepping on a snake on top of a book. And the idea that the snake is evil, and she's stepping on top of evil, on top of knowledge, right? But snake, depending on the cultural reference that you plugged in or dive in, it shifts. It's renewal. The snake loses its skin, right? This idea of regeneration. So in a sense, for me to add the snake became very important. This presence of this renewal, in a sense, a possibility, right? And then the dildo was very important to add to the sculpture. It's interesting how people react to the dildo. Right? Someone said so big, I'm like, is this size? The proportion, right? Perspective, right? But it's interesting to see how people react to it, because it speaks so much how this idea of sexuality around. Some people are just very, very intrigued or amused. Some people just shut. They just say, nope. So there's a conversation around that, even a reaction, right? And the dildo became something active to add to this iconography, right? Because to wear a dildo is an active choice, right? For whatever act. So that became very important for me from the beginning, right? So I get the sword, the scale. My father had a Lady Justice as I grew up, a Lady Justice statue. And so I grew up with that reference. When I was about 9, I think. I remember asking, why this thing, this costume, right? And then critically thinking about that statue as a blindfolded woman, right, representing these ideas. So there's always been very sort of convoluted for me. Anyway, so that's also that conversation around. But yeah.
Lady Justice turns dominatrix.
That could be true. It's a again, it's a possibility. I find it's as fixed as the sculpture is. I find to be very unfixed in meanings, right? Because it is. It's like what is that? Is it domineering? Is it not? Like it's, and again, it's the size. So, I know.
Do we want to open it up?
Yes. Yeah. Any questions? This is wonderful. Yeah. Any thoughts about anything? Right. Yes. Hello.
I have a question. Can you tell us a little bit about scale in these works? Because I think in particular these that are kind of a one-to-one almost in that relationship, and kind of why that was important to you, or what you were thinking about in terms of making that kind of choice.
Years back, for me, the scale became an awareness of a presence. As I started to print the work in different sizes. This is early on. I say about 5 years ago. Hues was very important to make it large, for it to be present. It's the idea that the scale is also visible, right? So the scale itself is a statement of visibility, of presence, right? And through that, I want the viewer, the audience, to also to come in and have the experience of the sharpness, of the texture, right? Any way that I can possibly bring an attention, it feels not only the color drives attention, the scale drives attention. And that feels very important to me. When I print the work small, it's very, very different. I do a lot of tests, right? Carolyn is here, photographer, dear friend of mine, and came to studio visit, and we're looking at there's a lot of process obviously behind all this, right? We're looking so many different little prints. And it's very different as an experience when you look large. My husband, when he walked into the show, the first day he came to me as everybody was arriving, he came to me and said, it's such a different experience to have this the scale. So he shifts the scale. Even when I print 8x10 or 11x13, doesn't have the same, again, not only visual impact, but the presence of them. I fantasize as well even going larger. What happens if I go make, right? What happens if I make something like quite large, right? So anyway, I feel like the size feels really nice. Especially the conversation of the gallery space. We can think about this gallery to be a small space, but it's not. It's really ideal, right? In relation to the proximity that we have with the work. So it doesn't. And with Rebecca was a conversation as well. Let's have all the color. Right? Let's put all the color. And then when putting the work up, the four of us here just all the permutations, right? All like to create something that feels like a visual statement. Right? Every time I try to do that on my own at home, it does not work. For me as an artist, I have to be in the space because the space informs the presentation of the work. Even if I do maquettes. I've done things like that, and it just becomes a waste of time. I'm like, why? Like, it's about bringing the work with the scale in the space, and then activate. So, yeah. Yes.
You've talked about unfixing, and I can identify with that. But you've chosen a medium which is all about fixing the moment, and it's a very traditional, old-fashioned. It's a medium which arrived in the 19th century. Can you talk about why you think the medium of photography is something you want to push against, maybe, or unfix? Are you unfixing photography? Why do you choose a static image instead of making a film or making a series of images? And maybe I see these images at the back. They're kind of in dialogue with these still fixed images that you have, and somehow they unleash the still images the way I read the show. Could you just talk a little bit about all that?
I think for me the idea of an action is important. All these images that we see here, they're in a moment of action, right? Like the gesture is that very moment, and then so photography is fixed, but I'm alluding to this movement. There's movement here, there's movement there. The idea of integrating low exposure to the work. So I've been doing that too, and some of them it's very clear. The long, like I do. 1 second in photography is long, guys. Right? 1,000 of a second is very fast. If you think about that. So 1 second photography, 2 seconds is a long exposure. 15 seconds is a long exposure. So I've integrated a long exposure to give this as much as I can this idea of fluidity. Right? And it's interesting you saying this idea of going against the medium itself, because I'm so critical of the medium. I love the medium, I teach about the medium, but I also teach with this criticality. It's important, because the medium is very problematic in relation to this otherness, this idea of stealing someone's portrait and then taking somewhere else, right? This idea of who is behind the camera to tell the story. So I feel like for me it's important to be the author and the subject in that conversation, because it gives me agency. But at the same time is to portray this moment of transition. Right? And I think Hughes was very important for me to be aware of that. Because in Hughes was a stage, it's a fixed representation. But even that, people who photograph with me for Hughes were in a setting for 2-3 hours photographing. We're constant movement. There's so much movement behind. So the work becomes about process. Right? Yeah. I guess my answer to that is. So it is this moment. Yes.
So for me, there's a lot of sound in these works, like the sound of the material that you can imagine, the sound of the color, it's very vibrant, or the sound of the motion. I'm just wondering, what is the sound on your end?
It's such a beautiful question. Because the sound for me is harmonious. It's really, and how I work, it's very, I get to a stage of being very in a harmonious moment. Because also, I play music when I'm doing this. And I listen to a lot of classical music. Always did. A lot of soundtracks. I'm very connected to orchestra. Very. Call me a queen. It's true. I'm very connected to this. And I like the emotion. The emotion that drives me. So I feel that this question is so important because I feel that the work that fully succeeds for me is when the harmony is all in there. The movement, the sound, so it's all really it's connected. So my answer to you is harmonious, because sound is just not one sound. I learned this in a class in photography many years ago. The teacher asked us to close our eyes and to pay attention to all the sounds at the same time. Even if we do this right now, we're not going to do it. But this idea to stay for about a minute, right? Just close your eyes and to let the sound be. There's a multitude of sounds everywhere, right? And to play that in photography, how to then translate that to a photograph. Everything is part of the photograph, every component. So I think in this image, in relation to your question, this multitude, it becomes harmonious, and then it's in the photograph for me. It's meaningful. I'm glad for that, but thank you, because it's interesting to thinking that in those terms.
Yeah. I mean, just pulling off that, I was thinking a little bit of their in conversation with Nick Cave's sound suits. But my question was about sort of.
He's an interesting artist, and it's someone who I explored as well and listen to.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, it's the conversations there. But I was thinking about how the refusal, and I feel like there's a set that are basically abstract objects that where the body disappears, and I find myself most attracted to those, and then there's the ones where the body is there. And I guess I'm wondering how you approach that. I mean, I guess this one, with the exception of having the backdrop role, like I know the body is there, but I think if we isolate them on their own, they become these abstract, fluid, refusal objects. And I guess I'm curious, like, how you decide to have some with and without.
There was an evolution.
Yeah.
The disappearance of the body is I arrived at disappearance of the body. A lot of the early works, it's my legs, my feet, it's my arm. I'm very present visually, right? And as I continue to work, it's about the gesture behind. Like here, I'm like, right? Like it's.
But it's so good that the body even goes away, which I think then allows for this other abstraction to come in.
But I fully agree. But for me, I also have to think about if the work doesn't have the body in an exhibition, for example, how to access. If I just say someone is behind that, I feel it's a different kind of relationship than seeing here. The presence of the feet, the leg or the arm, and then then it all connects. So as I continue the work, I don't want to just this. I think the visibility is also important. Right? So this dialogue happens. Because if I go just this abstraction, the work becomes something else. And I think it's important to understand there's a human behind that. Yeah. So but to arrive here, it took a while. It's interesting because I did a lot of photographs, and I did earlier photographs that I disappeared and it just didn't translate. And then somehow things start to connect. It's interesting, the life of an artist. People who are artists here understand, right? Like, because it's such a process, and it grows and develops, it matures, and it goes on. So to arrive at this image, it took a long time. Right now they're here. They feel, in a sense, okay, they exist. But to arrive to the existence was a very, very interesting journey. It's an odyssey. Yeah.
Well, they're visually stunning, but I love the way they want. I want to go in and touch the material. Like, I love that. That makes me feel like I'm like, well, I want to get into that. I love that aspect of it, especially the foam. I'm like, like I can feel what that feels like, you know? Like, I love that about it.
And I think the scale is important for that too, right?
Totally.
Because that gives us
and the color.
this, the color is inviting, right? Mm-hmm. Color is a very interesting medium. Thinking more and more color as a medium, that I'm employing color as a medium.
I just love that it gives me a tactile like feeling as well, just not just visual. It's lovely.
Yes.
What triggered me and invited me is that, especially when you start talking about how you came and how you want to unfix the boxes and that we label, is that the fact that it doesn't have the body, but you see the parts of the body, invites you, and you can, it's almost like you invert, you take the person and you just show the emotion, the stage, the psychology, and what you want to be. How can you be any kind, any mood, any psychology, anything you choose, any aspect of your, without the body showing, without us judging first the body. And it almost invites you, and I keep on thinking about kids and teenagers growing, that you enter an exhibition that and you get invited to explore yourself inside out. That's what I was trying to say.
Interesting.
It's like inside out. So you can go to this. And
Thank you
that's
for
what
expressing that. Yes, it's how do you think about the work to be psychological, right? It's an interesting comment. Because it is. There's so much psychology right behind all this, right? There's so much physicality. and political. I don't want to. I always want to, because I think so much about that. I find again, I'm going to revisit that conversation. This work for me is also very, very political, in my own way. Right? So we all have different ways of activate creativity. I feel like this is my way to just say to activate that.
If I could just say, it has all the gloss of fashion photography and the textures, the material, the colors that call out to you and all of that. But it's also reminding me from Terry's comment about the disappeared mothers in Victorian photographs who would hold their babies but be hiding behind the curtain. So this sense of all the hidden labor. And photography has a long history in the colonies as well of hiding people behind. And then the veil as actually this attractive decorative motif rather than, something that just is a tool of oppression, as white feminists would say. But it's actually like a beautiful decorative thing. And so you're doing a lot with hiding and showing as you move towards this abstraction.
I think about the shroud, right? It's a very beautiful word, I find it, right? But the idea of understanding the shroud as a set of different modalities that we can engage, right? Outside of oppression, right? Outside of repression, outside of being political harm and violence. So different ways to acknowledge that, right? There's a multitude of meaning within that. Any other question? Any other thoughts? No? Thank you all. Thank you, Rebecca. Seriously.